Hopefully this talk will kind of bookend the day and, align really well with the other themes of some of the other talks. But just in brief, I'm going to talk about the context in which we're working, which is starting from the beginning of the ontology analysis and construction process. So I'll introduce the ontology we're expanding upon, and the primary objective that we'll be discussing today is the ontologization process and the ontological analysis process that we implemented here with SEDOH data collection instruments, or social and environmental determinants of health, and those instruments being surveys and questionnaires. And with them being so unique and heterogeneous, that kind of forced us to explore alternatives for doing the preliminary analyses of the texts and source material. And then I'll discuss some of the pros and cons of those methods and its strengths, et cetera. So just breaking down the typical ontological analysis and construction process, just using their informational artifacts and their respective constitutions. We use domain source materials and expertise from those domains to then build controlled vocabularies. Upon taxonomization of those parent-child relationships, we then can derive a taxonomized controlled vocabulary. And upon axiomatization and incorporation of axioms into that entity relation model, we can then develop our ontology. And no ontology is ever finished, but as a result of that, there are naturally iterative processes that then continue to incorporate those expertise into the ontology. A core part of this process that can be a little challenging, especially with the size of the corpus, and if you're trying to generate or find a broader consensus, is the technical terminology. It's essentially used to then define and construct classes, but because this is largely a manual process, a human process, it can be a little bit vulnerable to human error, and it can also be very time and labor intensive. When we talk about the work concerning the work today that I'm going to be discussing, we primarily focused on work that would feed into one of the ontologies we already handle and have developed at our lab at MCW. And that would be the ontology for modeling and representation of social entities, which was formerly the ontology for medically relevant social entities. This is a BFO compliant ontology that is designed to support all OBO social constructs. The material for performing this extension is somewhat unique in that they are data collection instruments. So they're surveys, forms, questionnaires. These materials do not have associated data models, with very, very few exception. Prepare has some mappings, and Acorn does as well, to LOINC and SNOMED. But other than that, there are not a lot of options for mapping to data schemas, et cetera. Sticking only to those popular instruments, however, would essentially be a little short-sighted due to their turnover and their popularity of use and their cycling of use. So they have their own life cycles. They are updated iteratively, and it doesn't promote the improved accessibility of these instruments and their use as a result of that. So if you develop classes to represent a limited number, you ultimately will find yourself needing to update those relatively quickly in order to support your use cases and your stakeholders. In order to cover the breadth of this material, and also to address the heterogeneous nature of these instruments, we decided to opt for, and this is somewhat an experimental approach, we kind of wanted to see what we would get out of just using an AI-enabled tool to extract and organize these lexical and semantic contents from these tools. And we would then essentially pose the question, is this useful for this process, for the preliminary process of defining those controlled vocabularies, those definitions, even axioms for the processes of ontologizing these concepts, and the parts of the instruments as well for our essentially attaining our goal. These tools, AI-enabled tools, as we know, and we've discussed in ad nauseum today almost, are very, very good sometimes, and obviously with a fair amount of caveats, at averaging information content or summarizing text-based information. Naturally, there are some problems with this, but we'll get to those in a moment, and obviously we can all discuss after the talk. One of the tools that I use a lot to summarize material and have my own curated library from which I'm drawing that information is NotebookLM. Some of us have talked about this tool in particular earlier today at the panel this morning. This tool leverages essentially your defined library to source restrict the outputs for the purposes of content summarization and synthesizing potentially new ideas and other guidance. It has a lot of pre-configured output types that can be also potentially useful, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. It also allows you to customize the voice. So if you wanted a talk show host style of presentation of the information, you can do that if you so wish. And also it is supported by Gemini 2.0, which is different from just relying on one NLM or LLM. It is able to pull from external information if it is so requested. Or rather prompted, because sometimes it invents its own prompts, and I will talk about that in a moment. Obviously, there are a lot of cons in the sense that we've already discussed many of those today, so I won't reiterate too many of them, but there are content type and data formatting limitations to consider as well. So the inputs and outputs are kind of delimiting when it comes to what you can plug these things into after you've developed or processed or queried and then retrieved an output. So the reason that this is particularly useful and easy to use and favorable for scientific purposes is that it inherently maintains this internal provenance. So any of the constructs that it pulls or anything that it synthesizes as far as generating sentences, it will link to the source content that is then perusable, and you can decide yourself whether or not upon dissection that it's qualified or justified, etc. So the reference of the key material and the source material that you've provided it is a benefit, and I definitely appreciate that. I'm sure other ontologists do as well. For this approach, we essentially decided to do a real deep dive on the instruments available, collecting over 200 of those instruments. We ultimately were able to then pare that list down to 96 based off of some inclusion criteria. We had to be very selective about this, and some of them we were kind of pressurized to conclude. So we naturally sourced from various official publishers and academic organizations and other intellectual authorities, including medical associations and certification councils. And we also made sure that in each one of these instruments, they contained at least one original question item. And this was a little tricky because if you look through the literature documenting and regarding these instruments, it's very, very clear after just a quick perusal that essentially they cannibalize each other quite a bit, and sometimes they don't properly cite their sources when they do repurpose an instrument item from another source, and so that can be really difficult to trace down. But ultimately, we opted for originality, or at least what could be concluded from the validation of the instrument. And that actually pivots to the other inclusion criteria, which is that they should have at least undergone one form or another of peer-reviewed validation by those domain and those field experts. And ideally, the full-length instrument, some form of it, whether it's PDF or otherwise, was somehow publicly accessible. And I say publicly accessible here because sometimes this may or may have not been with the approval of the publisher or those that have rights to it, which is why this library is not necessarily publicly available, because there might be some copyright infringement there. But obviously, we're able to pull the content and use it in NotebookLM regardless, but not directly referenceable. And there's a lot of problems with all of that, obviously, but it's difficult to, I guess this is how I can simplify this in saying that if you're going to be using the instrument, you're also inhibited by these same things. And so that's kind of the perspective we approach this with in terms of the inclusion criteria. If you're going to be using this instrument, these would be the things that you would probably be looking for and be limited by. So moving on, after we've curated and developed and imported our custom library and having converted all of those instruments into PDFs in that process, we were able to do a number of different things, but I'm going to focus on one example. This example in particular is the prompt to simply generate a comprehensive data dictionary and corresponding data model of a specific questionnaire, this questionnaire being the ACS questionnaire. With this particular case, I only selected two of the source, the library content, so the source items, and that was the ACS questionnaire and the BFO text. So I didn't specify here, and I should have. But in addition to the 96 curated instruments in PDF form, I also imported the textbook Building Ontologies with Basic Formal Ontology by R. Smith and Spear from 2015, because I was hoping that this might also then guide some of the resulting outputs. And ultimately it did, but to varying degrees, and I'll discuss that in a moment. The prompt resulted in the assertions, several assertions from the output. One was that the data gathered by the ACS questionnaire could be grouped into approximately 3 main domains: that of contact information, household person information, and housing unit information. Then it proceeded to generate tables for each domain, including the described headers. I tried to map these approximately using these lines here, just so you could see one-to-one, because I can't fit the tables in here, obviously. But if you want to see the tables, I have those as well. But obviously, we have some overlap in between these different categories, but it also lists the questions from which or rather to which these domains were assigned. And so that's easily traceable to individual questions and whether or not they actually suit those. So if I wanted to double check, I could do so. Continuing on, another byproduct of this output was essentially a proposed ontological data model and conceptual framework. You'll see on this slide that I've used a lot of quotes because I disagree with essentially what the content was, but this was the label that was assigned by Notebook LM when it produced these outputs. It resulted in defining the following points, one being the core ontological universals. There was a table per one of these for each one of these subsections, so it was able to distinguish what an independent continuant was and assign those accordingly, and the same for dependent continuance and occurrence. Then it produced ontological relations, and again, this is why I use quotes here, because we can see that it put relations and equated it to axioms. It did produce a table, and it was somewhat helpful. But I will say that obviously there are some blatant generalizations that we wouldn't typically axiomatize in this form. So these are patently wrong for this particular use case in this particular detailed example. The detailed example here being what's highlighted on the right, and is also an individual item that was produced by this output. So we can see and emphasize as a result of this emphasis that there's a little bit of quality issue with definition writing and axiomatization. But if we tuned those prompts a little bit and adjusted our sources, so it allows you to select different sources that you've supplied it in your library. If you adjusted those combinations, you could improve the quality somewhat, but again, to varying degrees. So I mentioned that it has predefined outputs that you can select, and it will generate a unique structured item. Sometimes it's a text item. Here we have the option of a mind map that I'm kind of illustrating the output for. So if you want to kind of just get a topic level understanding, for example, of our example instrument here, the American Community Survey, the ACS questionnaire, you can see that it began to create this mind map structure. So it has the questionnaire content, and then it has 4 major categories. These 4 major categories, it kind of pulled out for the purposes of viewing them here because it's too big to fit on the slide again. But you can see here, if I expand these, we get A, B, C, and D for the children of these nodes in this mind map. And you can see that it's pretty useful in that it categorizes, it kind of summarizes the subsections of the tool and essentially the content average of those items and the topics which they address. I would kind of look at this as more of a topic analysis. And if this is your desired goal, this is very useful because not only you can identify the structure of the instrument, but you can also identify the topics within the instrument. So just to conclude very quickly, this tool is very helpful for a number of things, and obviously it's very open-ended at this point, and I do apologize that this wasn't very rigorous in terms of its analyses. I would have loved to do a comparison of different tools and their outputs, but this addresses one of the shortcomings actually of this tool is that it doesn't actually record your prompts that you construct, which is, it irks me continuously, and I recommend that anybody that uses this tool record your queries and also the configuration of your library at the time of query. So it is able to summarize large collections of very heterogeneously structured source content. The outputs can be helpful and very informative in terms of extracting information that you might be able to use from those very heterogeneous sources. The predefined outputs are really cool, interesting, and helpful, but again, reusing them in a formalized sense, so like publishing them. This is more like an open-ended exploratory phasing. So I wouldn't recommend this naturally for anything publishable, but the outputs in the process are at least the preliminary phasing for the ontological analysis process. And additional recommendations that I personally recommend: when you configure the chat, make sure that you're doing it to suit your needs properly. Be very thoughtful about constructing your custom source library and make sure to do it initially. Don't continue to add items. Make sure that you construct it and then you select accordingly in terms of configuration. Record your queries, as I already mentioned, because that's not a function that is currently a feature within NotebookLM. And with that, I will acknowledge my supports, including CTSI at MCW. That includes Brad Taylor for some of the support with the data and the data warehouse, et cetera. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, and we can chat and go after discussion points, et cetera, especially when it comes to standardization of these kinds of playgrounds for the ontologization process.
Vocabulary.